I would love to introduce our next speaker today, who I'm just so honored and thrilled to be able to interview. Again, I interviewed him last year, and he's just a wealth of knowledge. Robert Doman, Jr., and I call him Bob Doman. So, Bob, do you go through Robert Doman, Jr. or Bob?
No, I am Bob.
Okay. So I don't know why I have it on my list here. So I call him Bob Doman. Here, he is the director, president of the National Association for Children Development. You guys might have heard it as also be called NACD. He founded that in 1979. We are going to be talking today about processing, thinking, being present, and global maturity, which, oh my goodness, I can't wait for this subject. I think it's going to be so helpful for so many of you guys listening. Before we get started, though, Bob, what's the reason you got so passionate to help our community since 1979?
Well, actually, it's been long before 1979. My father was a physiatrist, which is an MD who specializes in rehabilitation. And I kind of grew up in rehab centers with brain injured kids, Down syndrome children, children with a full range of developmental problems. And studied psychology, got into the field, started off as a special ed teacher. At the ripe age of about 23, I became clinical director of one of the largest United Cerebral Palsy organizations in the country, in charge of all the therapists and educators. Worked for a variety of organizations in the United States, around the world. Was involved in what was called the Doman Autistic Unit back in the early 70s, which was an organization that focused specifically on autism and its related problems. As you said, started NACD in 79. We are an international organization with chapters around the United States and a number of chapters around the world, treating kids from virtually everywhere in the world with a broad range of problems. So that's it in a nutshell.
And, I'm excited because I feel like it's so hard to find anybody, truly. There's only maybe a handful of people that have been around, really not just, they don't just stop and say this is the end all be all. You continue to learn and you continue to grow and you continue to add to your knowledge. And I just feel like, everybody listening today, you guys are in for such a treat because I've learned so much from you over the last few years I've known you. And I'm always honored to be able to talk to you and to be able to talk with you in our community. So, we're talking about processing, thinking, being present, global maturity. People might be listening going, okay, how does that have anything to do with autism? I know back when I was first learning about your methods and the way you do things, I didn't even understand what that meant. And so you are really the first one to use and apply, the term neurodevelopmental. And what does that mean and why are there implications for those or what are the implications for those on the spectrum?
Well, thanks, Kristen. Neurodevelopmental essentially means that the foundation of all development is neuroplasticity. That we generally, significantly, if not dramatically, can alter and accelerate development through judicious application of targeted, organized, specific input. Neurodevelopmental also incorporates a perspective that development follows steps, which build upon each other, and that whether we are dealing with a typical child or a child with developmental issues, that we essentially can't cheat the system, that we need to put the pieces together properly. Now, if you understand neuroplasticity, virtually anything is possible. We can go way beyond teaching skills and actually develop and normalize function. For parents with children on the spectrum, if you will, it's the scientific foundation for hope. The trick is, how do we use it to the child's advantage when dealing with children on the spectrum? And how do we redirect the actions, behaviors that negatively impact their development and unfortunately trigger negative neuroplasticity or improper wiring with what's the resulting lack of development.
So when you're talking about neuroplasticity, like I'm thinking of a parent and they just got the diagnosis. Let's say they're listening right now and they're thinking, okay, I heard that in science class a long time ago. I'm still like, how is this really applying to my kid?
If you will, neuroplasticity specifically means that development occurs when we provide the brain with specific, appropriate input with sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration. All of our growth, all of our development, everything we learn is a reflection of this neuroplasticity. Okay, so this, if you will, if you really understand this, anything is virtually possible. For example, we've worked with children who the areas of the brain responsible for vision are destroyed. Kids with extensive brain damage. And with neuroplasticity, we can teach healthy areas of the brain to carry out the function of the injured areas of the brain. And there's so much redundancy in the brain. There are so many neurons to work with that if we really can be specific, we can do tremendous things for virtually everyone, including typical kids who we can make really accelerated. So specific, appropriate input delivered with sufficient frequency, intensity, and duration. That means a specific thing done often enough with sufficient intensity over a period of time is going to physically change the brain and change how the brain functions. Now, we refer to individual programs we develop for all children as TDI programs, Targeted Developmental Intervention Programs. Targeted is really important, right? Because that means specific. Targeted is specific. The further we get from specific with a specific child, the less effective and efficient we are. So an understanding of neuroplasticity and development also helps us understand that magic pills don't and can't really exist. Proper diets, in some cases supplementation, help with general health, absolutely, and improve health. And a healthy gut certainly helps. But you cannot build neural pathways in any way other than through work and providing your child with very specific, appropriate input.
Now, what are the triggers, or are there things that trigger negative neuroplasticity and impair or stop development?
If you will, those things you perceive and even those things you think affect neurodevelopment and affect how the wiring develops. So for our kids, at the top of the list are what I call DSAs, or debilitating sensory addictions. These addictive behaviors include all the repetitious behaviors that are commonly referred to as stims. These stims involve sensory play surrounding underdeveloped or improperly developed sensory channels. The DSAs can involve all of our senses or combinations of our senses. This sensory play tends to reinforce what is broken and delays or prohibits normal sensory development. Other than stims, other forms of DSA generally involve perseveration. Perseverative behaviors that many people don't realize are going on and that they are DSAs are things like kids' addiction to specific videos or songs or apps on their iPad. What occurs with all of these addictions is that the children memorize the video, songs, etc. Then when they watch them or listen to them, their brains look for the patterns, and the child anticipates what's coming next. And when the event occurs, they get an endorphin rush and build their addiction. To the brain, these addictions are no different than drug addictions. So for kids who have any kind of stimming, sensory play, stuck on things, those are addictions. And the addictions are negative in terms of neurodevelopmental development and essentially are triggering negative neuroplasticity.
Now, it sounds as though, the DSAs are obviously not good for our children's development. What else gets in the way of their development?
lot of what we learn simply comes from paying attention to our world. If we are present, our brains process thousands and thousands of pieces of information every minute. Now, as an example, last night I had dinner with my son Laird and his wife Sadie and my little 8-month-old granddaughter Ariel. Now, of course, my attention during dinner was all on Ari. But watching her, she was totally present. She didn't miss anything. She observed everyone and everything that was going around her in that restaurant. And when she could, she attempted to interact with everyone in the restaurant. Okay? Because she was present, she took in an incredible amount of information, which stimulated her brain, which helped stimulate neurodevelopment. Now, if I've been at dinner with most of our kids on the spectrum, they would have displayed varying degrees of being present, and their degree of being present would have determined what and how much they would have learned from the experience. If they were stimming, they weren't present, and they weren't learning. If they were replaying a video in their mind, they were not being present, and they would not have been learning. To a significant degree, we can equate how present the child is with where they are on the spectrum. The more present they are to significant things in their environment, as opposed to things that are feeding their DSAs, the more they are learning and the higher their function. So if you will, the more normal the sensory function, the fewer perceptive behaviors and DSAs, then typically the more present the child.
Now, is there anything else that impairs the development?
Actually, quite a few, including health and physiological issues. But one of the tougher issues for parents is that when we slow down development, we change the brain's perspective, and the brain gets diverted from seeking higher levels of function. Now, I'll explain that a little bit. For a typical child, change is their norm. And for children from birth to about 7, change is dramatic and fast. You watch a typical baby and they jump from developmental level to developmental level like magic. Their brains are programmed for change, and they seek the next thing, the next level change. If you slow down development, as with most of our kids here on the spectrum, change is no longer the norm. Staying the same is their norm. And they want to stay in their comfort zone. And as such, unfortunately, a child often fights any change, preferring to stay right where they are. Now, parents would think all they have to do is teach a child some skills and think that maybe you put 1 + 1 together and that's going to produce a 2. They're often very disappointed. Right? Because Johnny is often very happy just staying right where he is and will very quite possibly resist any change. This does not help us trigger neuroplasticity and further development.
And so when a child shows no motivation to move forward, right, I mean, I don't know, what do we do? Like, I know what to do kind of somewhat now because of you, but what are people listening? What do they do?
Yeah, unfortunately, the tough reality is we have to move them out of their comfort zones. And we have to push, pull, prod them to move them ahead. At this stage of the game, one of the huge pieces involves building the foundation of cognition, helping them learn how to think. Because the better they can think, the more tools we have to motivate and direct them.
And that's sometimes hard for the families, though, I'm thinking, because, it's easy to keep it in the comfort zone. But the thing I've learned from you, if you keep them in the comfort zone, they're going to be that way. They're not going to be able to move forward,
No, it's tough because, one of the foundations of being a parent is you want your child happy. And for kids on the spectrum, sadly, happy often is them just staying where they are, letting them sit and stim and be in their zone. And unfortunately, we can't let them do that.
We got to work them. But you have tips and tools on how to do that, and that's what, if you're listening, the family's listening. That's what's so amazing, is that you will learn the tips and the tools. So one of the big questions parents have typically is trying to understand what their child thinks. I think as a mom, especially of a child with special needs who has limited language, I constantly look at my son thinking, what are you thinking? Like, what's in your head? Do you have wants, like, other than just telling me what you want to eat? Do you have things that you think about? Like, I don't know sometimes, right? So, since our kids have been crawling and since they've been little babies we're holding, we're always thinking of that, right? So do you have any insight for parents?
One of the things I do every time I see a child is sometimes I say it out loud. Fortunately, most of the time I don't. I simply say, what? What is going on in there? What are you thinking? And how is that affecting your function? So it's a huge question. Now, there really are two primary factors that determine how and with what complexity all children, including those on the spectrum, think. Those pieces are processing ability, which includes short-term memory, working memory, executive function, and the ability to think in pictures, visualize, and the ability to think in words, conceptualize. For children on the spectrum, we generally have an imbalance with the children not being able to think as well as they should in words, but primarily thinking in pictures. So we've got to address those issues, build the foundation, and build a proper balance between visualization and conceptualization.
And so why does this imbalance exist for so many children on the spectrum?
It kind of goes back to the problems of just simply having delayed development. Not only does the brain want to stay put, but the brain also gets too good at doing some things because it stayed there too long. And visualization is a prime example of that. Many children on the spectrum have a variety of auditory issues, which delays the understanding of language. Now, if you will, children begin life as visualizers because language is meaningless, to an infant. So to think without words, you think in pictures. So as they begin to process more and more language, we start developing a balance between visualization and conceptualization, thinking in pictures, thinking in words. But slow down the auditory part, and the children become better and better and better at visualizing. All right, so they become absolutely great visualizers, but unfortunately that further slows down the development of conceptual thought and language.
Now, is thinking in pictures and visualizing an efficient way to think?
In combination with conceptualization, thinking in words, visualization can be a great complement. If you're an engineer or you're trying to remodel an office like we are at the moment, it's extremely helpful to be able to visualize. It's a big part of who we are and how we think. But if you can only think in pictures, that can be very limiting and result in a great deal of rigidity. It also tends to make it difficult for children to remain present and even maintain eye contact. But for a child who is a strong visualizer, they cannot think and process visual information at the same time. Now, as an example, what I often have parents do to demonstrate this is I ask the parent to maintain eye contact with me and to add 67 and 85 in their head. And what most parents have to do is break the eye contact and look up and to the side, visualize those numbers, 67, 85, and add them together. Right? So they cannot visualize and maintain eye contact at the same time. Unfortunately, insisting that children on the spectrum maintain eye contact more often than not prohibits them from actually processing what you're trying to say to them, understanding it, and from thinking. So thinking in pictures with limited processing ability essentially means that the child's brain is having to learn and is seeking patterns and learning patterns, which can be helpful or create significant problems. Patterns are broken. Now, if you will, the child develops a mental video library, consisting of those videos they have watched and memorized, or scenarios that cover everything from the pattern with which they get dressed to what or where they will eat, or the mental video of the visit to the doctor or the dentist, to grandma's house, all right, on and on and on. And these mental videos make it tough to change the patterns. The child who cannot think in words cannot reason, and thus cannot think their way through a situation that does not match their mental picture. But that's really tough for the kids, and really tough for the parents.
So what happens if reality doesn't match a child's mental picture?
I think for a lot of kids, it's like they're falling into the abyss. An event for which they don't have a picture, an event that veers from the mental picture, can be truly frightening to them. I mean, the kids, often you see kids act like they're frightened out of their minds, and it's because they are frightened out of their minds. They don't, you've broken the pattern. They don't have a picture. If they don't have a picture, they don't have words to think, oh, this is okay. Mom said this is fine. This is fine. It's okay. The words aren't there. All they have is a broken picture or no picture. So it becomes really imperative that we build auditory processing and develop conceptual thought so the kids can function without a picture or have the ability to modify the picture.
So how do you build conceptual thought then?
Well, we build conceptual thought by putting the developmental pieces, the foundation together. Thinking in concepts is thinking in words. We need words. The more words we can process in a sequence, and the more words we can hold together and manipulate, the better. All of this comes under the heading of auditory sequential process.
So what does that mean then? Because I'm sitting here thinking the listeners are going, that sounds great. Tell me more. So what's auditory? So talk about that part.
Well, at NACD, we spent the last 40 years working on trying to understand and how to develop the foundation of cognition: short-term memory, working memory, executive function, and long-term memory. We can lump these primary pieces under the general umbrella of processing. These basic foundational pieces determine not only how much we take in and process of what is being said, but also how many pieces we can hold together and manipulate, which, if you will, equates to complexity of thought, and which in turn also equates to global maturity. Working memory, that which permits complexity of thought, is now correctly being perceived as more significant than IQ. Okay, so if you will, putting these pieces together of auditory sequential processing, is what permits our level of function. And fortunately, neuroplasticity is such that if we're specific and we're targeted, we can build this.
So now what about, we're talking about the beginning. You talked about it, a little bit of short-term and long-term memory. How do we start all this? How do we help our kids with this? I know some of the tools because we do it with Jax, but, how do we start building the short-term memory, and what changes can we do, and what do we see when we do that? That's the other probably question.
So if we look at auditory and visual processing, for the sake of discussion, let's focus on auditory processing, which is generally the bigger issue with our kids on the spectrum. So if your child can process one piece of verbal information at a time, such as, if you can say dad to the child and he looks at dad and makes that association, he or she's processing a one. Okay. If you can say window and door, and they could then look at the window, then the door, then they process a 2. Right? Name 3 things, then they are a 3. Okay? Repeating a word or a sequence of random words also demonstrates their auditory processing or short-term memory. For a typical child, auditory processing develops at a rate a bit less than 1 piece per year up until they're about 7 to 9 years of age, at which point the processing without some intervention is pretty much that of a typical adult. Right? So short-term memory is the foundation of working memory, which relates to the complexity of thought. So short-term memory, all right, is how many pieces you can listen to and process. So if you will, if you're speaking to your child who processes a 2 in a complete sense, like you say, Johnny, I want you to go up to your room and get your socks and bring them downstairs. All right, you're talking to yourself. Okay? Because if you're lucky, Johnny can process socks, maybe upstairs. Okay? So, part of developing this is understanding where your child is. And if you're targeting what you say to fit your child and move them to the next step, you are speaking to their level of processing.
So now what's the next piece then? Like, what's the next thing we do for working memory? And, can it change or can it also develop? Like, I'm thinking for a kid, like Jackson's going to be 15 in a couple of days, Is this only for people that are younger?
No, neuroplasticity, first of all, exists as long as we're breathing. We, as an example, we have a group of adults with Down syndrome in southern Utah who often came to us in their 20s, 30s, 50s, and even one fellow in his 60s. And neuroplasticity is such that these individuals, some of whom didn't speak at all, have learning to process, so they now speak. They're learning to read. They're doing all kinds of things as adults they never did before, simply because they are getting the specific targeted input they need to produce development and increase their brain's ability to function. Now, relative to auditory short-term memory, one of our issues is simply hearing. Our kids on the spectrum have sensory issues. Most have visual issues. Most have auditory issues. Many have tactile issues with their ability to smell things, taste things. But relative to building auditory processing, we first need to look at hearing. And many of the kids have different kinds of auditory tonal processing issues. Now, essentially that means that they don't hear all frequencies of sound properly. Some frequencies are overstated, some are understated. All right, so many of the parents will, if I ask them, how's your child hearing now? I'll say that my kid hears just fine. He hears that airplane before I even hear the airplane. Well, that's not fine. But generally, if we have overstated frequencies, we have understated frequencies, meaning the hearing is distorted. And unfortunately, an audiogram won't give us that information. We can pretty much only observe the child's function and determine if we need to work on improved tonal processing. Back, when was it? I guess the late 90s, we developed a listening program to help address tonal processing issues. That's after having worked with Doman and virtually every other form of sound therapy there was. And the other issue relative to hearing is figure ground processing. And this kind of relates to the slowed down development. If you will, little children's brains are tuned into environmental sounds that tend to be more meaningful than language for little kids. And it's those environmental sounds that keep them alive, all right? So they're hearing what's coming, what's out there, what's, those high-frequency, low-frequency sounds that are out in the environment. For a typical child, language starts having meaning, and they start attending more to those middle frequencies of language and start tuning out those higher and lower environmental frequencies. But as I said before, with our kids, when the development is slowed down, what happens with them is their brains keep paying attention to those environmental sounds rather than to language. So you call that distractible. So we've worked on developing techniques and methodologies to address figure ground processing. We have a whole variety of what we call TSI, targeted sound intervention programs, to address that. So we start off by, making sure that the child can hear well. If you will, then working on auditory sequential processing kind of is a representation of what we need to do to target any kind of instruction. Now, in truth, if you're trying to teach anyone anything, the most efficient way to do it is to target the input based specifically on that individual. Now, for example, if you're teaching math, and you want to be teaching math at just the tiny step above where they're functioning in math. If you're teaching a couple levels above, they're not going to understand it. If you're teaching a level below, they're going to get bored. Every aspect of instruction relative to accelerating development means we need to be as targeted as we can be. So if your child is a 1, we want to work to get a 2. Not a 3 or a 4, but a 2. We can't get to 3 without first getting to 2, right? You can't cheat the system. You've got to go through each step, and you need to target your input to reach that step. By the way, a word of caution for our kids in the spectrum who have generally the superior visualization skills. If you're testing auditory processing, they'll often give you a false reading. Now, ideally, when we're testing auditory processing, they're measuring the individual's ability to listen to a sequence, essentially repeat the words to themselves, and hold and manipulate that information as words. However, many of our kids in the spectrum will hear a word and change it to a mental picture. Then they hear the next word and they add on that picture, and on and on. Now, it isn't a bad way to memorize a sequence. It's kind of mnemonics. But it isn't a measure of auditory sequential processing. So we have to observe kids carefully when we're testing auditory processing and modify our testing procedures accordingly for them.
Well, and I know.
Yep, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I know when you were talking about the math, and I wanted to make sure I made a point on this. So for those listening, so my son does NACD, and one of the reasons I love talking to Bob so much, but, it was fascinating because we were trying so hard to do all, the standard stuff we would normally do. You go, to Target and you buy, or Toys R Us or wherever, you go to the school supply store and you buy the different books of math and reading. And even if our children, like Jackson, like I said, is going to be 15 in a couple of days, by the time you guys are hearing this, he'll have already been 15. And, he delayed very much so, but doing better compared to where he started. But yet, it didn't matter how many games I played, it didn't matter how excited I got, it didn't matter how much fun I was. I could not get that kid to be able to look at 1 + 1 = 2. I could tell him. Now, here's when Bob was talking about this, it was fascinating when you're saying this. So when I would ask him what's 1 + 1, he would say 2. Right? If I said, what's 2 + 2? He would say 4. He memorized that in some way. However, if we would have it in a book and you'd say, you show a 1 and a 1, no, he would not understand that. And it wouldn't matter if I got bears and I said, how many bears? He just could not figure that out until we started doing, when we were doing the processing skills that you were telling us, and working with, there's different games and different tools, and I know every time you do a thing for a child, you do it differently, but for what for us, and I've heard others, that work within ACD, some of the times we get some of the same tools, and because they work, right? So the Magnadoodle was one of the tools that, and Bob would, if you're working with him, would explain all that. But it's so amazing to me to watch what I had gone through for not months, but years, trying to get him to be able to move forward. And we like to use the word plateau, and then we like to then say, oh, is this a resting place? Well, we were resting and napping for a very long time then, because we could not get past, trying to figure that part out. And yet, I'm not joking, it was pretty fast, actually, compared to, how long we had been doing it, where he really just picked that up. And I remember watching that going, oh my gosh, and it seemed so simple, once Bob broke it down, but then I clearly didn't think how to do it, and it's not something that most parents have in our toolboxes, right? And so, oh my gosh, it was to me this kind of aha moment, for lack of a better, terms, of wow, I could have been doing that this whole time, and yet here I'm just making it so hard on myself, but I'm also making it really hard on Jackson, because he would get more and more frustrated because it was too advanced for him, and I wasn't teaching him the way that his brain was thinking. So anyways, did I summarize that pretty good, Bob?
Yeah, no, that's great, Kristen. And what you're saying is, if we're targeted and we're one-on-one, and the input is taken a step at a time, and it's targeted to where the child is, learning occurs. And unfortunately, the reality is, often not doing that just isn't inefficient. It just simply doesn't work. So yes, being targeted and specific is huge. To give another illustration relative to auditory processing, it's interesting to look at auditory processing and language. Typically a child who processes a 1, which is, generally a child who's a year old, they'll come out with a few words, a few spontaneous words. You get mom, dad, bye-bye, that kind of stuff. When they can sequence 2 pieces, we get directional language. And the child will use specific language to achieve specific things. So you get drink and eat and go. And then you start getting, when you're getting 2s, you start getting couplets. Then you start getting things like hi mom, bye mom, hi dad. When we sequence 3, we start getting more couplets, more 2-word phrases. Then we start getting some 3-word phrases. Then we get initial 4-word phrases. And when they sequence 4, then we start getting more 4s and start getting some 5 and initial 6-word sentences out of them. So the language, expressive language, becomes a direct reflection of that auditory processing and how many pieces the child holds together, how many words they can hold together in their mind. So it's very cool seeing these correlations.
Well, before, because I don't want to run out of time, I want to talk about, how does all of this, I know there's so much more we could talk about. We should really do way longer sessions with you. But how does all of this affect what you refer to as global maturity?
Okay, global maturity essentially correlates with complexity of thought. Now, if we go back to a 1-year-old, kid processing 1 piece, they're generally happy if you give something to them. They take it away. My little granddaughter, I give her something, she's happy. I take it away. She doesn't much care. She looks at something else. She's easy. When they start sequencing 2, complexity of thought takes a jump to I want or don't want, which generally produces a terrible 2. That's when you start getting all the tantrums. You don't have enough processing power to reason with the child yet. All right, so that's a tough period. Then you get to 3s. Complexity of thought is a little bit higher, but generally at 3s, I call it lock and block level, which is if the child perceives something as being fun, non-threatening, easy, fine, I'm happy to do it. But if any way they sense it's important, it's difficult, it's threatening, they just lock up on you. That's a tough period. It's not until we get sequencing up to about a 4 that you really can reason with the kids. All right, and life starts getting easier. Now, one huge concern for every parent with a child on the spectrum should be when the child's processing complexity of thought, maturity, and look at it relative to the age. Now, if your child is 6 and processing like a 3-year-old, that isn't a huge issue. But you know what? If your child is 12 or 13 and starting puberty with a processing of a 3-year-old, you are looking at serious trouble. Throw the hormones in the mix, a big, strong kid with a 3-year-old's processing skills is not a good picture. So addressing and looking at this picture globally, is a very, very, very big deal. And as parents, you need to be acutely aware of where your child is and get them moving on. Getting older isn't going to make them better. Getting older just makes them tougher. Development doesn't occur because you get older. Development occurs because you provided the child with specific, appropriate input.
Absolutely, and as a parent, sometimes it's hard to kind of buckle down and do some of the stuff that's not always easy to do with our kids. And one thing I do love what you say too is that it really doesn't matter the age, and we briefly talked about this, but I think it's important to revisit. I go to so many different conferences, and they always offer hope, but at the same time they always say, but it's so much better when you get the child younger, which yes, we understand that. We wish we all knew all this when our child was 2, kind of thing. But what do we tell a parent out there that, regardless of what age they are, it doesn't matter if they're 2 or 15 or 22 or even 52, one thing I've learned from you is that there is hope, but can you maybe elaborate on that?
No, again, the foundation is neurodevelopment. And neurodevelopment doesn't stop. And as long as we can work with a child, provide them with a specific input, change can occur. And it can happen at any point. And the key for parents is to understand that and demand that their children receive the input they need, that they receive the specific targeted input that fits them, addressing all of their pieces. And if we do that, development can occur, and it continue to occur as long as we're providing the input. But if we don't, it's not going to happen. Age is not our friend.
And so, one thing before our time is ending here, which I can't believe it's almost ending, but I want people to really understand a little bit, too, about what NACD is, because I think it's such an amazing service that you guys provide. And, when I tell people about it, it's almost like they're just blown away. They're like, how come I didn't know about that? Or what do you mean, what do they do? And do you have a good summary to explain, what you guys do at NACD for the families?
One of the things I understood early on in my career is that the existing model attempts to work with pieces of children. And working with pieces of children really doesn't work. So a big part of the reason I started NACD was with the understanding we had to work with the whole child within the context of that child's family. And we need to make priorities based on that global picture, the gestalt of who that child is, where that child is. And we have to work at all of those specific important pieces and move them together and not work at splinter skills and try to make development occur through pieces. So NACD, what we do is we work with that whole child, we work with the whole family, we design a comprehensive neurodevelopmental program to fit every aspect of that child's development, from their physical function to the sequencing we're talking about, the processing skills, the educational pieces, the behavioral pieces. Put it all together, work with the parents and, accept the parents as those who are most knowledgeable about their child, and put the parents in a position of power to help affect change to what they are doing. If the child's going to school, help direct what's happening at the school, provide a comprehensive treatment approach to really change the child. And we do that through chapters around the country, chapters outside of the country. I just came back from Bucharest and London. We work through Skype when families can't get to one of our chapters. And we work very closely, very comprehensively. Every family has a coach. Every family is encouraged to communicate with us. If they don't communicate with us enough, we get on their case, right, Kristen?
I started laughing. Yes, they do.
We to the degree to which we communicate with a family determines the degree to which we can help. And people mistakenly assume that because I do this kind of work, I'm a very patient man. The reality is I'm not, and I teach my staff not to be. We want to produce change. Yesterday would have been great. Well, except tomorrow. Okay, but we go from a parent's perspective, I think, which is we can never do this well enough or fast enough, so we're always working to do it better.
And what is your website so people that want to learn more and get in contact with you guys?
It's nacd.org.
Well, you can tell how long they've been around, too, because I don't know many people that only have 4 letters in a website these days.
Been a while.
Yeah, so nacd.org. It has been such a pleasure. It's always a treat to talk with you. What final message do you want to leave with the parents out there that might be feeling hopeless or helpless, or they're just still feeling a little lost?
Okay. Parents, believe in yourselves. Believe in your knowledge of your child. Be your child's advocate and push to make sure your child is getting what they need to change. And if your child isn't changing, guess what? They're not getting what they need.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for taking the time. I know how busy you are. I know that the families that are listening got so much out of this. He also has, and when you go to the website, nacd.org, I'm pretty sure there's probably a link to the YouTubes there. The YouTubes are so valuable. I highly recommend. Nowadays there's so much information and you don't always know where to go, but that's a resource that is free and it's right there, and I definitely would highly recommend for you guys to check that out. And again, don't give up on hope. Our kids are capable, and that's the thing I've learned from Bob. They're capable at any age. So thank you guys for listening, and thank you, Bob, for taking the time.
You're welcome, Kristen. Take care.